Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. My name is Heather and today I am here to wrap up all of the books that I read in December, which is quite a few. I did have a couple that I had started reading at the end of November and that hung over into December, so I will give you my final thoughts on those. I have quite a few physical books here as well as a couple of ebooks. So settle in with a drink or a snack while I tell you about all of the things that I read. First of all, a book at the bottom of my stack that I had kind of forgotten about until I went to get the stack for this video, and that was A Life of My Own by Claire Tomalin, and this is one of my holdover reads. I was in the middle of it when I filmed my November wrap-up, but I still had a ways to go, and I can't remember if my thoughts in that video will match my final thoughts, so I'll fill you in on those. I really enjoyed this biography. Claire Tomalin is a prolific biographer herself, so it was really interesting to read her memoirs of her own life. They very much match her writing style in her biographies of other famous authors, but it's also very approachable and very readable. However, there are many, many trigger warnings in here. Claire Tomalin had a quite tumultuous life in terms of her parents' relationships, in terms of her own marriages, in terms of problems with her own children and child loss and disability, and losing siblings. It really does make for a tough read, but honestly, it was still fascinating. I love that she was still relatively hopeful at the end of it, and I really loved this final line. It really spoke to me as an opera lover myself, and that is, "If I had to describe perfect happiness, I might say it is hearing the first bars of the overture to The Marriage of Figaro as the orchestra starts to play at the beginning of the evening. Even writing the words brings a smile." I love that. That is a wonderful way to look at life. Next up, in December, I finally finished listening to and reading Phineas Finn by Anthony Trollope. I started this in October, I want to say. It usually takes me about 2 months to finish this, mainly because I'm listening to it in 20-ish minute chunks as an audiobook, which really doesn't get me very far in terms of pages. This was not my favorite Anthony Trollope that I've ever read, and I think that's a fairly universal feeling about this book. This is the second in the Palliser series. There is some crossover with book one. Lady Glencora makes the occasional appearance, but the recurring characters really aren't the focus of the story. In this one, we're focused on Phineas Finn, who's a young barrister from Ireland who decides to try to make his way in Parliament in London. And in that way that Anthony Trollope has of writing young men who are well-intentioned but who make all of the wrong decisions all of the time, Phineas is yet another of those young men, and that can be really frustrating to read at times, especially being so deeply inside his head and hearing how he rationalizes really terrible decisions, especially the ones that touch on his love life. I honestly thought those plot lines were going to go in one particular direction. I'm mostly glad that they didn't, although I do worry about Phineas Redux and if any of those decisions are going to come back in that book. But luckily I have a book in between before I go in and find out. There were also a few minor instances of really racist language, and yes, I realize it was the Victorian age. They did not recognize the harm that that does the same way that we do. But honestly, I had never heard Anthony Trollope or any of his characters use phrases like that before, and I recognized it was in the mouth of a very minor character. I'm not even sure if we were supposed to like that man. So it really shouldn't matter that much, but in the middle of what I considered a cozy, relaxing read in the middle of my workday, to suddenly have a character use an expression that uses the N-word really jolted me out of that, so slight trigger warnings for those. Now on to the digital reads, and my first digital read that again I started at the end of November was The Third Gilmore Girl by Kelly Bishop. This is her memoir of her entire life growing up, how she began to work on Broadway, being in the original cast of a chorus line, and then eventually transitioning into films like Dirty Dancing, and eventually ending up playing the mother, Emily Gilmore, on Gilmore Girls. I really enjoyed this book. I loved hearing about all of her time. I am always fascinated hearing about Broadway work, as well as, of course, film and television. I've been a devotee of Gilmore Girls for a long time, though I have never watched the later seasons, nor A Year in the Life. After a while, it just lost its touch for me, but the early seasons are gold, and I love them. I also loved how Kelly Bishop used this book as a vehicle for change and changing of perspective almost, in that she describes some really hard decisions that she has had to make in her life, especially as concerning women's rights, and described that in great detail and really laid out how that has influenced her politically. And I really admire her for that, especially knowing that it would be published around election season. Then I also had my hold on Ruthless, Vows come in by Rebecca Ross. This is the sequel to Divine Rivals, which I read last month. And so since it's a sequel, I can't tell you very much. This is a highly popular young adult fantasy romance, and it is very clean, or at least fairly clean. And it describes two young journalists who end up on opposite sides of a war between two ancient gods, and through their typewriters, which can send messages to each other, they fall in love. I enjoyed this one a little bit more than the first one, in that the first one was great, and I thought the romance plotline was laid out really well, but it was difficult to understand the war and why it had started, who were these ancient gods, what did they stand for, how had we come to be where we are? That was a little bit tough for me to understand. The second book definitely makes that more clear, which I really appreciated. Then another sequel also came in for me, which was The Ballad of Never After by Stephanie Garber, and this was the sequel to Once Upon a Broken Heart. And I read that one back in August, and I really loved it. It's fun, it's whimsical, yet another young adult fantasy romance that is very hard to explain. So I will just refer you to my August wrap-up to hear my explanation of book one. Book two took some really interesting turns. The romance was still really gripping and the plot was well paced. I kept wanting to read to find out what was going to happen to Emmeline next. That ending took a turn. It took a turn that I never expected, and honestly, I'm still not entirely sure how I feel about it. Nor am I sure how I feel about where it puts us leading into book three. So we shall see. I haven't had my hold on book three come in yet, but it should be in round about a month or so. So we'll find out. And then lastly, at the end of the month, I applied for a bunch of different arcs on NetGalley, and one came in almost immediately. So I managed to finish that before the new year, and that was The King's Messenger by Susanna Kearsley. I have been reading Susanna Kearsley's books for a few years now. It all started when my dear friend Amanda gave me The Winter Sea, which you can see here is in Pride of Place. That one is still my absolute favorite. And she tends to write historical or time slip romances that are also very clean that usually center around Scottish history. Not always, but typically. And this is another one that fits that bill. It's purely historical. There are no time slip elements. And it's about a period that I really don't know that much about, which is the reign of James VI of Scotland, James I of England, which has never really appealed to me. The 1600s is a bit of a dark spot in terms of my historical knowledge. And so we follow a young woman whose father needs to travel to Edinburgh, and so does this young messenger who is working in the service of the king, and he also needs to go to Edinburgh. Specifically, he needs to arrest a political prisoner and bring him to Edinburgh. And since her father's not very well, he allows them to come along on this trip. And they end up becoming this ragtag bunch traipsing through the lowlands. They pick up a young boy along the way who grows to admire Logan very much. And of course, a romance blossoms, and you get inside a number of the characters' heads, including the political prisoner, getting his backstory, all of which is a lot of fun. It did feel like it dragged at points. The ending was wrapped up extremely quickly, but it also brought a really interesting perspective to the royal marriage and the royal family, which I knew a sliver about, but her hypothesis of what it could have been like was really fascinating in terms of the fact that James and his wife Anna of Denmark had an older son, one that was older than who would be Charles I. But unfortunately, Henry died before he could inherit, so of course then Charles did. And so we get to see into the past and see what Henry might have been like, as he was very close to the political prisoner. And we also get to see what that might have done to Anna and James's marriage, as well as what their marriage would have been like in any case, who they were as people. Honestly, I found that more interesting after I had read the afterword, where Susanna talked about why she chose the perspective she did. Honestly, I wish it could have been a prologue rather than an afterword, but it does rather give things away, so I understand. So overall, not my favorite of hers, but it did bring up some really interesting points. So if you're also interested in that period of history, do look for it. I believe it's going to be published in February or March here in the States. Then, as we approached winter break, I managed to read a ton of books as I curled up by the fire. So the first one I read was a quick little novella called Looking for Captain Poldark by Rowan Coleman. And when I say little, I mean little. It is a tiny little pamphlet which centers around these four individuals who met online through their love of the show Poldark and meet up for the first time to go on a road trip to Cornwall to see if they can catch the show being filmed. You grew to love each of the characters. I loved learning what was going on in their lives. I liked the fact that this adventure helped our main character grow in terms of her mental health, but I wish it had been more than a novella. The ending definitely takes a high-stakes adventurous turn, which I was not expecting. All of it was positive. I just wished that we had more time to really explore everything that was brought up in this plot. Then I also read yet another D.E. Stevenson. This one was The Baker's Daughter, which I believe is a standalone. I don't believe it connects to any of her other works. It is set in a small town in Scotland in the 1930s, I believe. And we follow a young woman who ends up being hired to be a cook when an artist and his wife move into the Highlands from London. However, his wife leaves them on the first day that she is working as cook. And she thinks, well, I can't leave him here all alone. He'll starve. So she stays on being his cook and housekeeper despite her family's objections and the town's whisperings of what is this young woman doing living alone with this man. In typical D.E. Stevenson fashion, a romance blossoms, there's great personal growth, and it's just generally quite cozy and lovely. Then, in the tradition of telling ghost stories around Christmas Eve, I picked up The Winter Spirits by a variety of authors, including... oh, all right, I'm not going to cut any out. I'm just going to read them all. Andrew Michael Hurley, Imogen Hermes Gower, Elizabeth McNeil, Laura Shepard Robinson, Kieran Millwood Hargrave, Susan Stokes Chapman, Laura Purcell, Bridget Collins, Jess Kidd, Natasha Pulley, Katrina Ward, and Stuart Turton. I've read from a lot of these authors already, and Marissa of Blatantly Bookish gave this to me for Christmas last year, and I have been saving it up until the right time of year came around again. Most of these authors tend to write historical fiction, and a lot of these stories are historically based, which is what I use to comfort myself, as I don't typically read horror. However, some of these stories are contemporary, and they definitely lean more into the horror elements than the historical elements. As with any short story collection, I definitely preferred some over others. Some have stuck with me much more than others, but overall I have learned that I am not a horror person. Some of these were deeply unsettling, and I was very glad that I read them in the daylight. December also always feels like a time to pick up middle grade, so I picked up Hollowpox, The Hunt for Morrigan Crow by Jessica Townsend. This is the third in the Nevermore series, and I was very pleased to learn after I finished this book and hunted on Jessica Townsend's Instagram that we have publication dates for the final book. It will be coming out, I believe, starting in March and April in Australia and the UK. Sadly, not until June here in the States, but I will definitely try to pre-order it so it can be a nice end of the school year gift to myself. Again, given that this is book 3, I can't tell you much about the plot itself, but if you're familiar with the Nevermore series, you will know that it is another magic school type story where Morrigan is training to become part of the Wondrous Society along with a group of friends that she has been sorted into. And so we still follow their academic adventures. At the same time, however, there is a terrible disease spreading through Nevermore called the Hollowpox that tends to affect the Wunimals, which you can see here, which are animals that can talk and think and behave like humans. And naturally, it's very distressing, and it causes a great deal of unrest in the city. And Morrigan is determined to try and get to the bottom of it. And oh, does she. I had to tell you that part of the story because I found it freakishly paralleling what has gone on and continues to go on in society in recent years, which is really terrifying that we still behave this way as human beings when faced with something that we don't understand. And now I'm just desperate to read the last one, but I am heartened to see these types of stories being told in middle grade, and I hope that that message is really sinking in for the young readers. Another middle grade that I picked up was Portraits and Poison, which is the second in the Lizzie and Belle Mysteries series by J.T. Williams. This one, again, follows Lizzie Sancho and Dido Bell, two real historical figures of color in Britain in the 18th century, and we follow them when they are about 11 or 12 years old, and they have teamed up to try to solve mysteries. And in this case, a portrait has been painted of the Sancho family and Dido Bell and her family, and it is the first painting of Black and interracial families. And they are so excited to show it off at the Mansfield's estate. They have a large party. It was painted by a young woman of color. However, on the night of that party, the portrait is stolen, and more threats start appearing in Lizzie and Belle's lives, mainly in Belle's life. And so these two girls have to get to the bottom of what is going on. I thoroughly enjoyed this one. I didn't love it as much as the first one, but it is still wonderfully written with really fabulous messaging about diversity and the importance of representation in all forms of art throughout time, what art can tell us from the past and in the future, as well as providing a really well-plotted mystery. And I feel like all of those elements are so important for middle grade readers. I really wish they published these in the US as well as in the UK. But J.T. Williams being an educator, I'm not surprised that she has done such a good job of communicating those themes for a younger audience. And I really hope she writes more. I haven't heard if there are going to be more, but I really hope she does. And the final book that I read in December was A Death in Diamonds by S.J. Bennett, which is the next in her historical mysteries series, although I suppose you could read it first. I was talking this over with Megan the Story Girl when I was about halfway through it. And you could in fact start with this one and then backtrack to the 3 that have already been published, because this one does not continue in the modern era. The first 3 books were all set in around 2015 or 16, and we follow Queen Elizabeth II as she tries to solve mysteries that have happened around her with the help of her APS. However, this 4th book zooms us back into her past. It takes us back to 1957, when the Queen really got started trying to solve these mysteries, again, with the help of her APS. I wasn't sure that I liked this one at first for a couple of reasons. I think the Queen felt more unfamiliar. She wasn't the Queen that I knew and loved. The banter between her and Philip, of course, felt very genuine, but I wasn't as familiar with politically what was going on at the time. And so it was just harder to get to grips with her and with all of the new characters, all of the new secretaries and politicians that were surrounding her on a daily basis. The mystery also felt a bit disconnected from the Queen at first, and I couldn't think why it would interest her. There's a death in a London neighborhood that the police uncovered where a man was strangled, possibly with a stocking, and he was also found in the room with a prostitute who had also been killed but was laid out very neatly in a very expensive tiara. And the police are absolutely baffled by many elements of this case. But I couldn't think what about that would interest the Queen so much that she would get involved. Later on, it definitely picks up. A lot of elements come together. It really brought to light a number of political things that would have still been going on, but that I, as someone who didn't live through those times, didn't necessarily think about at first. And unfortunately, I really can't tell you more than that without spoiling some plot elements. Suffice to say that I really did enjoy it towards the end. This one, I think, will be published in the US in a month or so, and I believe there's another one in the works as well, so I'll be looking out for this one, but for now, I'm just going to pass this copy around my family because my parents love this book as well, because my parents love this series as well. So those are all of the books that I read in December. Let me know down below if you have any further questions about any of these, recommendations for me based on what I read and loved or didn't love, or what your favorite read of the month was. Until next time, be safe, be well, and happy reading. Bye everyone.